Hi, I just thought I'd make this video because I'd had a couple people ask me about my screaming technique and how I do it, so I thought I'd just make a video explaining a little bit about how I figured out how to do it and how I've built on the technique over the years. And yeah, hopefully you can learn to do a similar thing. One thing I'll start off by saying though is I've never had any formal singing lessons or screaming lessons, so I kind of just figured out how to do this on my own. So because of that, the techniques might not be 100% how it's supposed to be done, but I mean it's never caused me any serious, vocal trouble or anything, and I've been doing it for years, so it must be at least at the very least an okay screaming technique. If you did want to do this regularly, sort of in a band, I would recommend getting, formal singing lessons by a teacher who's qualified and knows what they're doing more than me. But anyway, I'll teach you what I do. So yeah, when I first started learning how to scream, obviously like most people, I had no idea what I was really doing. And I looked up and read about this technique called false chord screaming. And I was given sort of just some basic tips like start out with a heavy sigh or try and bark like a dog and stuff like that. And as silly as it sounds, that actually was one of the most helpful tips to kind of get me started. An example of that would be this. So what I did there was I'm not really tensing my throat at all. I'm not really using my primary vocal cords to do anything when I'm doing that. A lot of people are going to try and make that sound by really tensing their vocal cords and making them sort of slap together, which you're not going to want to do because that'll just make your voice feel rough instantly, and the more you do it, you're going to tire your voice out and probably hurt yourself. What I'm doing there is the air is going past my primary vocal cords and vibrating the false chords above. And I basically went from just doing heavy side, sort of putting more, pushing more with my diaphragm and projecting that kind of airflow more, and it went from just a heavy sigh to something more like this. And that's just like the basic false chord screaming technique. One thing I'd want to mention as well is that my scream kind of developed in two layers, if you will. Like I learnt to do false chord screaming as like the foundation, but then I wasn't happy entirely with what it sounded like, so I kind of added more voice to it and made it more shouty later on. So I'm gonna talk about both in both parts of that in this video. So yeah, you basically used that technique for the first few years when I was, doing these kinds of vocals and when I first joined Assimilate. But around 2013, I think it was, just before we released our first EP, we did some demos for one of the songs, and that was the first time I'd ever heard myself being recorded, and I just wasn't happy with it completely because it didn't sound like what I wanted it to sound like in my head. Like it still had all the rasp there and sounded kind of cool, but I thought it'd be more powerful and more, shouty almost. So I was like, I need to develop this into something a little bit different. So I started trying to add a little bit more voice in, which I ended up doing on the first Assimilate EP, and then because I still wasn't completely happy with the vocals on that EP, I then tried to add more of my voice in for Irrational Fears, and that's the technique that I've used since then, which is kind of like a half false chord scream, half shout, I guess. Basically, for the more voicey version of my scream, which I do now, it's a little bit harder to do because if you don't have the false chord screaming down already, you might try and just put too much pressure on your actual voice and then just blow your voice out. But what you basically want to do is you want to use air and like your diaphragm to make the false chords above your main vocal cords vibrate in that way, but while you're singing or holding a note, like, and have them both happening at the same time, but you're not causing the distortion by slapping your main vocal cords together. And here's some examples of me doing that technique.
I can't find a reason to believe in wasted education through the ignorance that they feed. I don't believe you!
And one more thing before I finish is that obviously everyone mentions this in screaming videos, but it's important. If you're doing it and your voice hurts or feels really rough afterwards, then you've obviously put too much pressure on, you know, your actual vocal cords, and you've done something a little bit wrong. So take a break, try again the next day. You know, if it hurts, you're not doing it right. Yeah, I hope that's helpful. I'm probably not very good at teaching this, but I'll put some links in the description for people that can explain my technique better than me. So yeah, cheers.